Good afternoon, everybody. Let's start. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, welcome to the 5th high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance. My name is Maria Ohisalo. I'm the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change from Finland. I used to work as a Minister of the Interior, but I'm happy to be here. Happy to see so many of you here, and it gives me great pleasure to co-moderate this high-level ministerial dialogue together with my distinguished colleague, Her Excellency Aminat Shauna. We both look forward to what we are sure will be extremely enriching discussions in the next 3 hours. Just one housekeeping remark. The high-level ministerial dialogue is being webcast, and there is an overflow room available in meeting room 21. Simultaneous translation is also provided into the 5 UN languages. And with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Her Excellency Aminat Shauna.
Thank you very much, Minister, Excellencies, and also a very warm welcome from my side. I also look forward to what I'm sure will be lively discussions in the next 3 hours. With this, we would like to first give the floor to the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC Secretariat, Mr. Simon Steele, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, my friend. Distinguished ministers, colleagues, delegates, dear friends. Let me begin by thanking our co-moderators, Minister Shauna from the Maldives, Minister Ohisalo from Finland, for their help in guiding our discussions this afternoon. This dialogue on climate finance is a vital step towards the establishment of a strong financial framework for the future. I'm going to call it as I see it in this intervention. The experience of the $100 billion has left caverns where trust should be in our process. We all know nothing in life comes for free. Action requires finance. The good news is there is a lot of money out there. Our job here today and within this process is to get it flowing and delivered to the right places. We have universally recognized the priority of finance in our process. Under different terms, finance, investment, funding. The notion of financial support is mentioned over 70 times in Glasgow's cover decision. I want us to build on what was in Glasgow and recognize that we need to do things differently. We have to build in transparency from the outset on commitments and pledges. It's not an afterthought. We have the ad hoc work program for the new collective quantified goal on finance to help us avoid some of the pitfalls of the past. We must learn from the past. Not surprisingly, all parties agree to this. Progress on this front, using the $100 billion as a floor and considering the needs and priorities of developing countries, would be a very positive result from Sharm el-Sheikh. A view of strategies and actions underway to redress the balance between finance for mitigation and adaptation is also a crucial task. Last year in Glasgow, a commitment was made to double the provision of adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025. I want to see how that will be delivered. Improving access on climate finance is also essential. We have experienced unprecedented times over the last 2 years. This should give us confidence that we know how to respond when things are no longer business as usual. The scale of the problem we are facing requires a whole of society mobilization to combat. All our efforts must be aligned. Our entire international financial architecture has to be up to the task. I've heard concrete calls by the visiting leaders for MDB reform. I'm keen we actually figure out what that means over the course of the next 12 months. Let me end these brief remarks by commending the recent report by the high-level expert group on climate finance, which contains a host of valuable insights and recommendations. The report is clear. Acting on finance is in every country's interest, be they developed or developing countries. Climate finance is not an expense, but an investment in justice, well-being, and our future. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Now it gives me a great pleasure to give the floor to the special representative of the President of COP27, CMP17 and CMA4, Ambassador Weil, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Minister Aminath Shauna, Your Excellency, Minister Maria Oisalo. Thank you also, Executive Secretary Simon Steele, for your inspiring remarks. It gives me great pleasure to deliver my remarks today to you, Excellencies, as we inaugurate the first high-level ministerial dialogue on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Standing Committee on Finance for all the hard work that it has done over the past year. In a few minutes, we will hear directly from SCF members where they will share a recollection of the work on the 5th biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows, and on the report on progress towards achieving the goal on mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year. The excellent work of the SCF helps us in discussing and hopefully moving forward on some of the crucial underlying issues that have a direct bearing on the issue of long-term finance. As you all know, the COP presidency has centered this COP around the urgency of moving towards implementation. With that in mind, it continues to be disconcerting that the goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year is yet to be fulfilled. And we have all heard many statements expressing disappointment and serious concern around that issue. For implementation and enhanced ambition, provision of support is absolutely crucial, as you all know, and there is general acknowledgement that more needs to be done to ensure the support is available. Also, as we all know, the scale of needs of developing countries, particularly with regard to adaptation, is immense and will continue to grow as ambition needs to be enhanced. There is urgent need to reflect this in our collective actions. And I would strongly urge you, Excellencies, to bear this in mind today. Cognizant of this, we very much welcome the Climate Finance Delivery Plan Progress Report and would like to extend our gratitude to our distinguished colleagues from Canada and Germany for their hard work on this. In a few minutes, you will be hearing from them directly. Their Excellencies Morgan and Guilbeault. We look forward to hearing from you in a few minutes, Minister. Last year, parties decided to continue discussions on this very important matter. And for that, the presidency would continue to convene high-level ministerial dialogues biannually. In line with the mandate from last year, we have convened you here today to deliberate on the progress and fulfillment of the goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year by 2020. Following this mandate, we have convened you today, Excellencies, with the aim of ensuring effective political engagement and open, meaningful, and robust discussions. As you know, the President has also been mandated to provide a summary of deliberations at the end of the dialogue. I therefore look forward that what we trust will be meaningful. We look forward to what we trust will be meaningful discussions today and would strongly encourage you to interact with each other in the course of the next hours. With this, I would leave you in the good hands of Her Excellencies Shauna and Her Excellency Oysalo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And this brings a conclusion to our introductory session.
Thank you. And with this, we would like to invite Her Excellency Diane Black-Lane, member of the Standing Committee on Finance, for a presentation of the 5th biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. And just waiting for the slides to come up. My name is Diane Black-Lane. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda, and I sit on the Standing Committee on Finance as a representative of AOSIS. I co-facilitate my presentation today with my colleague from Belgium, who's not here. So I'm happy to see if this works. Technology is working.
There it is.
Oh. Okay. I hope you can see this. So thank you to my co-chairs and the Executive Secretary to the UNFCCC. And today, Vicky and I worked on the biennial assessment. We'll give an overview of the financial flows for the period of, I think it's 2018 until 2020. A key graphic that has been a feature of every BA is the onion diagram, which shows the overview of climate finance flows in the years 2019 to 2020. It is a helpful way of framing different flows globally and from developed to developing countries. I'm not sure if you can see it there. Flows from globally from developed to developing countries, public and private, and the major sectors. Blue shaded areas indicate global climate finance flows by sector, and green shaded areas indicate flows from developed to developing countries, with the UNFCCC funds at the core. Please note this is not drawn to scale, it's just indicative. Not sure. Oh, here you go. So a key finding is that the global climate finance flows are increasing. There were 12% higher in 2019 to 2020 than in the previous period, reaching US $803 billion per year on average. The graph shows how the increase was driven by mitigation, investment in building and infrastructure, sustainable transport sectors, and by investments in adaptation in particular. Climate finance from developed to developing countries is also increasing between 6% and 21% from different sources in 2019 to 2020 compared to the previous 2-year period. 6% growth in climate-specific finance reported by Annex 2 parties in their biennial reports, 17% by MDBs, and 21% through multilateral climate funds. However, most climate finance providers and contributors did not meet the 2020 climate finance mobilization targets. Overall, more public finance flows is committed for mitigation than for adaptation, as in previous years. However, a positive trend is that adaptation finance has grown significantly through bilateral channels and MDBs compared to the 2017-2018 period by 39% and by 48% respectively. Okay, I'm still struggling with this technology. Okay, if I can, I'll try and get the secretary to come and assist. But the next slide should have shown that the adaptation finance to developing country is predominantly delivered through grants. The slide is stuck here. Oh, here. Well. Okay, so the adaptation finance to developing country is predominantly delivered through grants, in particular 57% of bilateral flows and 99% of multilateral climate funds, shown in the dark blue bars in the top graph. while mitigation finance predominantly takes the form of loans as shown in the light blue, here we go. Reflecting its geographical and population size, the Asia and African regions receive the largest total amounts of public climate finance, support to least developed countries and smaller and developing states, as a proportion of overall finance flows remain at a relatively stable compared to previous years, by 20 to 25% for LDCs and 2 to 7% for SIDS. All right, the next. All right. With regard to climate finance in the context of broader climate finance flows and the opportunities and costs associated with the climate transition, it is clear that global climate finance flows are small relative to the overall needs for climate transition, which is what you've been saying before. And if I can draw your attention to our teardrop diagram, which formerly the bubble diagram, it's not very clear here, but economic losses from weather-related catastrophes during the period of 2019 to 2020. It says 36% here on the screen. It means it increased by 36% during that period of time. So we can imagine for the Standing Committee making this presentation in the not too distant future, we can imagine based on our incidents from the period of 2021 to 2022, how much this would look like. This diagram places in context the US $803 million of global climate finance flows to other amounts, such as the US dollar $4.5 trillion in annual flows needed for a net zero pathway. So I hope this presentation on behalf of the Standing Committee is helpful to you to continue your discussions this year. Thank you very much, and back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Diane Black-Lane, for this presentation. And with this, I would now like to invite Richard Muyungi and Gabriela Blatter, members of the Standing Committee on Finance, for a presentation of the report on progress towards achieving the goal of mobilizing jointly US $100 billion per year. You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellencies. My name is Richard Muyungi. I am from Tanzania. I'm the member of the Standing Committee on Finance, and myself and Gabriela, we were privileged to lead, to co-facilitate the work, and now we wish to present the key findings of the technical progress report towards achieving the goal of mobilizing jointly USD 100 billion per year to address the needs of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency of implementation. Excellencies, this is the first time this work was undertaken by SCF for consideration by the COP, as I said, in response to the mandate from COP26 in Glasgow. The SCF, the next slide, shows that the SCF, under the guidance or the report, under the guidance of the committee, was innovatively put into 3 areas. The approach which we took looked at the 3 dimensions, not only on the finance flows for the 100 billion, which you see on the left, but also whether and how the needs of developing countries are being addressed, and the progress in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and the transparency on implementation. Now, a wide range of sources of information were used to provide quantitative and qualitative information on those 3 dimensions, and of course the interlinkages between them. There is a table in the report that provides all the resources used, and the methodological challenges and the limitations are also noted in the report. 2 key challenges were identified. One, was the lack of the detailed guidance on how to measure and track progress on the goal, and of course the limited data available and the consistency on climate finance flows in relation to the two other dimensions of the goal. Now the third slide, which you see in front of us, provides, if you go back please, provides the key findings. As I said, there is a wide variety of different views in how to account for the finding towards the goal that, of course, lead to a variety of conclusions. The chart, which unfortunately I don't think we are on the very right slide. I don't know how we can go back. Do we have 2 slides back? If you can go back 2 slides back, please. Because the chart, I wanted to give you the chart on the left. You go back.
I can't. They have to go back a slide, please.
Please. Yes. The chart on the left shows the backward-looking data, which is based on different sources. And these sources use similar data but have different approaches on the scope of what should be included, such as public or private flows or grants or loans. In any case, none of the sources suggest that the goal has been met in 2020, as you can see. Now, if you look at the forward-looking estimates, however, there is a signal that the goal could be achieved in 2023 within a range of 101 billion to 106 billion as per the Climate Finance Delivery Plan. The next slide gives us, yes, this slide gives the dimension of how the goal is addressing the needs of developing countries. The report used a proportional comparison of finance flows to the needs reported in the SCF report of 2021, which is the need determination report. This comparison was motivated by the recognition that in terms of addressing the needs, of course, the volume of the goal does not match the needs, but in terms of what the finance is targeting, they are almost the same. It should also be noted that there is a mismatch in the time frame of the needs in the needs determination report, mostly from 2020 to 2030, while this report gives the flow which are in the range from 2019 and to 2020. And of course, as you can see in the visual at the bottom right, adaptation finance, you see that in the light blue, represent 28 to 34% of the finance in the 2019-2020 against the 14 to 52% of the share of the cost needs in the middle and the number of expressed needs at the top of the graph, as you can see. In terms of the sectors, almost half, which is 46% of the finance flow, is going to the energy and the transport sector, whereas other sectors play a greater role in terms of needs such as agriculture, forestry, and water. And with regard to the geographical distribution, the share of the finance flows by region are similar to the share of the needs expressed for Asia, which is 42% vis-a-vis the 39% needs, and for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is 17 vis-a-vis the 18% needs, but more finance is needed to flow to Africa compared to the needs. You have the needs of 36%, but the flows are just 26%. With these excellencies, let me hand on now to my colleague to continue with the rest of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Excellencies. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. On the dimension of the context of meaningful mitigation action and transparency on implementation, a key challenge is to establish any causal link to to flows of finance directly. The data in that regard is quite scattered, and yet some notable trends since 2010 include, for example, almost all parties have signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. Parties communicating ambition on mitigation increased from 88 in 2010 when the goal was formed to 194 in 2021. An updated NDC results in up to 10 to 14% aggregate emissions in 2025 above 2010 levels, an improvement from 14 to 19% from initial NDCs. This range is based on NDCs up to the end of 2021, and including the information from the 2022 NDC synthesis report would lead to an improved range of 9 to 13% above 2010 emissions in 2025. That's a positive story, but we're still not quite where we need to get. Many sources of information point to the importance of transparency on implementation with regard to action and support to enhance mutual trust and accountability. Almost all Annex 1 parties have submitted fourth biannual reports by 2021 with information on climate actions as well as support provided. By 2021, 94% of non-Annex 1 parties have submitted a second national communication and 59% a third national communication, including information on actions and needs. 51% have submitted a biannual update report, which also includes information on support received. Next slide, please. The key challenges and lessons learned from implementing the goal include first the mobilization of private climate finance to and in developing countries underperformed relative to expectations, up to 60% below what was in the scenario of the 2016 roadmap by developed countries. The report identified some of the ingredients in scaling this up, not to mention cross-cutting enabling environment factors, finance to de-risk projects, and the role of MDBs and guarantee instruments. However, the environment to mobilize is now more challenging than even a year ago, requiring consideration by developed countries on how they will achieve the goal. The multiple economic shocks and high debt burdens, in particular in developing countries, create circumstances that will likely require more concessional public climate finance. Next slide, please. International public climate finance is critical, and the challenge is on managing the high demand for both adaptation activities and for de-risking mitigation activities. Overcoming capacity gaps in building project pipelines and making better efforts to mobilize private finance are important. Also, that increasing access to capital requires innovation, such as, for example, simplified access modalities to funds and innovative instruments to access capital markets. Overall, the report found that significant knowledge gaps hinder a thorough assessment of progress towards the goal. As mentioned earlier, there has been very little data-driven analysis on the linkages between the various dimensions of the goal. A key lesson is that robust goal setting is specific with clear metrics or methods at the outset to guide successful implementation. And with that, thanks for your attention, and now I head back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the good presentations, and this concludes the introductory part of this high-level ministerial dialogue.
We would like to now turn to the interactive part of the ministerial dialogue. And as was announced on the website, the presidency has identified a number of guiding questions which we can see on our screens now, which will facilitate discussions during this ministerial dialogue. Based on these questions, and in order to kickstart our discussions, we would like to first give the floor to a few key icebreakers. Let me first invite our distinguished colleague, His Excellency Stephen Gilbert, Minister of Environment and Climate Change from Canada, for our first icebreaker intervention. Minister.
Merci beaucoup, coprésidente. Je tiens à vous remercier d'être parmi nous également aujourd'hui. L'objectif des 100 milliards reste au cœur des négociations. Et je sais que nous, les contributeurs des pays développés, restons déterminés à fournir des financements pour le climat et à faire en sorte que les fonds aillent là où ils sont le plus nécessaires pour s'attaquer aux causes et aux conséquences des changements climatiques. En même temps, une conversation honnête sur le financement du climat est une conversation équilibrée. We have to go back to 2009 and remember the context is in which this $100 billion goal was very aspirational, and there was a lot of cynicism and skepticism about whether or not we would ever get there. And in 2020, we weren't there. We were at $83.3 billion, so part of the way, but we are getting there, but we haven't closed the gap yet. Last year, one of the key functions of the Climate Finance Delivery Plan was a process of driving more climate finance contribution to close the gap. And it worked. We've seen significant additional pledges in 2021, which are not yet built into the $83.3 billion. Last year's delivery plan also helped on transparency to demonstrate that the goal will be met next year. So the delivery plan was an important moment of recognition and input into key mandated documents, for example, the Glasgow Climate Pact and Standing Committee on Finance report, which we've just seen. This year's progress report shows progress where more efforts are needed. We listened to everyone, and that was a cornerstone of the report. We worked closely with contributor countries, met with developing country group chairs, as well as ministers from the Global South, organized 2 roundtables with civil society. The progress report tells an important story about where finance is going, provides further insight on predictability and transparency for the coming years. It provides also important examples of progress, but also highlights where more work is needed. And there are 4 areas, in our view, for further work. Barriers to access, adaptation finance, advance greater leadership from NDBs, and private finance. I will speak to access and adaptation finance, and my colleague Jennifer will speak to MDBs and private finance. First, on adaptation finance. The progress report makes clear the expectation to double adaptation finance means going from 20 billion in 2019 to 40 billion in 2025. It also provides transparency on pledges made by contributors so far towards that goal. On access, it remains a significant challenge. There's lack of capacity, complexity of processes, and time needed to secure funding. Key issue is for all of us, and we are all united on that. A study on access was commissioned as part of the progress report, which identifying gaps and recommendations for further action. We need to reduce bureaucracy to facilitate access for projects proponents. There's advocacy for greater leadership from the multilateral banks to improve access, and again, Jennifer will talk about that. We encourage UNFCCC funds, GCF and GEF to harmonize approval processes with multilateral banks. And 3, to develop innovative approach to support capacity building. For example, Canada's work to create the Climate Finance Access Network, which deploys financial advisors in vulnerable SIDS and in the coming year in Latin American countries. On transparency, let me focus for a moment on transparency. The progress report was designed to enhance transparency. It is both backward and forward-looking information that is necessary for the predictability and accountability. Reporting mechanisms already exist under the UNFCCC and Paris on both ex post and ex ante. We need to do a better job of using these tools and not create new ones. And I hope we can continue to release annual progress report updates. I envision an important role for a developing country or countries to co-lead next year's progress report, a proposal I have already raised with the COP28 presidency. In 2009, developed countries committed to the key goal of $100 billion in public finance, including grants and concessional loans, but we know current goal is insufficient to meet the needs. We need a process to respond to the magnitude of the challenge. We need new goal to mobilize more finance than ever, and it's impossible without modernizing the contributor base and aligning all financial flows with Paris. This will address access to finance from the supply side and also essential to ensure barriers from the demand side are mitigated. We need to move faster. We remain fully committed to the $100 billion goal, which we will meet very soon, but even more important now is a process of getting fit for purpose, new goal right now. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister. Now let me invite our distinguished colleague, Her Excellency Jennifer Lee Morgan, State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action from Germany.
Thank you so much, co-facilitators. As you've just heard from my colleague Stephen Guilbeault from Canada, we spent the last couple of months engaging with parties and stakeholders to prepare the progress report to last year's Climate Finance Delivery Plan. And I think these conclusions are so important because they also pave the way to a more comprehensive understanding of international climate finance. Because to really support a just, inclusive, resilient transition, the financial system really needs a transformation itself. We need to redirect financial flows so that they support an acceleration to sustainable, renewable energy, and they support the phasing down of fossil fuels. And we also have to address finance more as a cross-cutting issue because many of the most vulnerable countries are critically indebted. So we need to create new instruments to support their efforts in building resistance on all levels. And we need a more inclusive approach that involves change agents such as MDBs and the private sector. So as Stephen said on adaptation finance, knowing that collective doubling provision was so important in 2019, we included in the report our understanding that the doubling would be from $20 billion in 2019 to $40 billion in 2025 based on OECD methodology. And I can tell you already today that the government of Germany is planning to make an announcement on the adaptation fund here. On private finance mobilized, well, we know it's critical part of the 100 billion goal, as public finance alone can't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It holds true for the goal, but also for the broader transition. But it's been challenging, and the report shows numbers on that. The OECD report, it was only 13.1 billion of the total 83.3 billion mobilized in 2020. So we also found that we lack the data to really see what are the challenges and the opportunities. So Germany and Canada, alongside a couple of other countries, have agreed to commission a lessons learned study on private finance mobilized to increase our understanding and potentially submit it to the new goal process. On MDBs, it's obvious that they have a crucial role to play in meeting the 100 billion goal, but also as well as the doubling of adaptation finance and for the future climate finance goal. And we're seeing signs of progress in how our development finance institutions prioritize climate, with MDBs scaling up the overall share of climate finance, including the World Bank. But an even greater climate finance portion is absolutely necessary. And beyond this, many contributors recognize the need for a fundamental reform of the business model, particularly of the World Bank. And in writing this report, we've heard significant support from major shareholders for better analytics of the costs of climate change, for consideration of the G20 capital adequacy review, for climate-dedicated capital increase, for creating incentives for countries to borrow for investment in climate action and climate resilience, but also for more concessionality in a context of significant debt burden and debt distress across the globe. This must be the way forward. And an appetite for reform is reflected not just in this report, but in other initiatives like the Bridgetown Agenda, a topic which is discussed here in the corridors of this COP. So as Government of Germany, we have chosen ambition and solidarity as our guideline for COP27 because we know about our obligations and our responsibilities. And dear colleagues, I invite you to join these collaborative efforts and ambition and solidarity. We have to transform this financial system in multiple ways towards a supportive and inclusive instrument for our common 1.5C goal, and we have to meet this 100 billion goal as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I would like to invite our distinguished colleague, His Excellency Saber Hussain Chaudhry, Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change from Bangladesh.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Moderator. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be able to make this statement on behalf of the least developed countries. And of course, the position of Bangladesh is completely at sync with that. What we would like to start off with is refer to 3 articles of the Paris Agreement. 2.1c, which talks about making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and, of course, critically for LDCs, climate resilient development. 7.6 article talks about the importance of support for countries, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. And of course, LDCs are front and center of that. And then Article 9.4, which emphasizes the need for public and grant-based resources for adaptation. So these are already reference points that we have in the Paris Agreement. And we all know how fundamental, how critical climate finance is when it comes to the adaptation needs of the least developed countries. We know that the extent to which we are able to respond to these needs will be dependent on the amount of finance that we have. So finance on the one hand is action, on the other hand it is ambition, and this is critically important. We need to have the balance between adaptation and mitigation. From the report that we have had, it is very clear this balance is yet to be established, and we need to ensure that we explore all avenues, and there has to be a very clear roadmap to the Glasgow Climate Pact of doubling adaptation finance up to 2025 and in allocation of different windows of climate finance such as the GCF, the Adaptation Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. Grants-based finance for adaptation plays a highly significant role for LDCs. Adaptation action, as it is extremely costly in our countries. LDCs are already facing debt distress and acute exposure to climate risk. We welcome the effort of countries that have recently increased grants within their climate finance. That is a sign of progress, but we urge to further increase these efforts in order to meet the scale of needs at play. The truth is that adaptation finance still remains vastly insufficient, and this must be reversed. Transparency on climate finance is key to trust building, but various barriers, including what represents climate finance, is a major obstacle. The diversity of definitions of climate finance currently in use and the complexities that this brings for clear aggregate accounting and reporting of climate finance continues to be a persistent challenge. So whether 80 billion has already been disbursed and whether we will achieve 100 billion next year very much depends on how we define climate finance, how we quantify climate finance. And without addressing that basic issue, we are always going to be looking at different scenarios and different results and outcomes. Alongside ramping up adaptation finance, addressing the needs of the vulnerable countries and also the various barriers climate finance that we have come across. Climate funds are extremely slow to access, complex, and resource intensive. It is therefore important to review procedures so that we can streamline them and ease the access to such important resources, especially for the LDCs. We can also look at the shortcomings of direct access modalities to the Green Climate Fund and identify ways to increase the number of direct access entities from the LDCs. The low number of LDC entities accredited so far illustrate the challenge to access much needed critical funds. It is vital to increase direct access to sources of finance and decrease reliance on international delivery partners and mechanisms. In terms of the lessons that we have learned from the USD 100 billion in the context of deliberations on the NCQG, we can make the following comments. Unlike the 100 billion, the post-2025 NCQG will be a negotiated goal, and the quantum will require careful consideration. Identifying and understanding the needs and priorities of developing countries is fundamental. We need to link needs and priorities to the determination of quantum. NDCs NAPs, and other climate action plans and policies are critical basis for this process. But alongside these, evidence of the needs of developing countries must also be based on scientific evidence like IPCC reports and that of UNFCCC. Again, secondly, unlike the 100 billion, the NCQG cannot be a static figure. As global warming worsens and we are unable to respond to it, we are unable to keep temperature rises to as low as possible, adaptation needs and losses and damages will increase too. So the goal must be revised at certain points and be scalable. The new goal must respond to increasing needs in developing regions and rely on mostly from public sources. We have also seen in the report how private finance has not really responded to the need of the hour. Fourth, NCQG deliberations must address concerns that climate finance increases the debt burden of the world's poorest countries. We must decide conditions for inclusion of loans as part of the new goal and consider alternative instruments such as debt swaps. We must limit the economic impacts of debt-generating instruments in vulnerable economies such as the LDCs. And the final learning from lessons of the 100 billion, the provision of financial needs to be balanced. The disparity in support between mitigation and adaptation has been widely emphasized by different reports and institutions for the past years. The LDC group has clearly and consistently highlighted the importance of balance between mitigation and adaptation support in accordance with the Paris Agreement principles. And the group has also advocated strongly for the inclusion of support for addressing loss and damage. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, our goal is to shape an enhanced finance framework that delivers on every aspect of climate action. This framework should accelerate mitigation, drastically enhance adaptation, and support loss and damage by dealing with the aftermath of devastating weather events. Thank you, Madam Co-Moderator.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Nafkot Dabi, Head of Climate Policy of Oxfam.
Thank you, Your Excellencies, and thank you, esteemed speakers, and our audience for being here and giving priority to climate finance. So let's state the fact. Developed countries have failed to deliver a much-needed climate finance to developing countries, to communities. And we know money is not a problem. We have seen how given the multiple crises that developing countries, communities are faced with right now, we have got to get the 100 billion right this time. And also we have to set a new goal based on needs and not political goals. Let us take a closer look at the state of the 100 billion. Developed countries are saying they have reached 83.3 billion in 2020, of which 68.3 billion has been public finance. However, it's not all as it seems. Oxfam estimates real value, that is climate-specific net assistance, to be between 21 to 24.5 billion. So this is a third of what developed countries are reporting. To make matters worse, 70% of the public finance we estimate to be in the form of loans, pushing developing countries further into debt. Even more concerning is the increase in non-concessional loans. For instance, between the third and the fourth biennial report, the percentage of non-concessional instruments went from 30 to 40% of the total. This figure is even higher for multilateral development banks. Non-concessional loans are being provided even to countries considered at risk of debt distress by the IMF. Even the Green Climate Fund, despite its mandate, is providing 51% of its total climate finance using non-concessional loans. This is for 2019-2020. So how can developed countries who are largely responsible for the climate crisis justify this, putting the burden on developing countries who are least responsible? So this is unacceptable. Non-concessional loans should not be incorporated into climate finance moving forwards. We need real grant-based funding increases, and developed countries need to provide a clear roadmap on how they will deliver the 600 billion from 2020 to 2025. Let's also look at the allocation of finance for adaptation. Only a third of reported climate finance went for adaptation in 2020. While this is an improvement from previous years, much more is needed. Developed countries claim that they have provided 28.6 billion in 2020, but our analysis shows the real value, that is climate-specific net assistance for adaptation, to be between 9.5 to 11.5 billion. This is far from the 40 billion doubling target. It is even far from the UNEP estimation of developing countries' need, which is 70 billion in adaptation finance annually. So at a minimum, developed countries should honor their promise from Glasgow and provide a clear roadmap on how they plan to deliver on doubling adaptation. So what can we learn from the 100 billion goal and correct in the context of the new collective quantified goal? There are a list of recommendations, but due to time, I will just prioritize two. Oxfam recommends, first, on climate finance definition, countries must agree on climate finance definition, on what can be counted as climate finance. On this, developed countries are stalling the discussion. But this issue must be resolved. As Oxfam research shows, lack of climate finance definition leads to a significant difference between the reported overall amounts and the real value of provided funds. Second, a refined methodology on how to count climate finance is needed, including for MDBs. On MDBs, since there's a lot of talk of restructuring MDBs or reforming, I want to mention something. A recently published Oxfam audit shows that 40% of World Bank's climate finance cannot be accounted for. So we need transparency. And we know that multilateral development banks are actually the biggest providers of the 100 billion. So on reporting, we suggest reporting on concrete sub-targets will improve accounting and transparency. For example, sub-goals on surrounding fair shares, grant-based support, support for gender, support for seeds, LDCs, most vulnerable countries, balancing mitigation and adaptation, support, etc. are critical for transparency in accounting. The new goal must make clear pledges for key topics, including a sub-goal for adaptation finance and one for loss and damage funding, and that these are grant-based in nature. Loss and damage finance should be new and additional to climate finance. Non-grant instruments should also be reported on a grant equivalent basis, and reporting on these sub-targets should be mandatory, not voluntary. Thank you for giving Oxfam the opportunity.
Thank you. With this, I'd like to invite Mr. Ambrose Fayo, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, as the Vice President of the European Investment Bank.
Thank you very much, Madam, and I will speak as EIB has been chairing the group of multilateral development banks in 2022. We heard the call to continue delivering and scaling up climate finance, and the message is very clear, and as we all know, international financial institutions cannot meet these tremendous needs for investment alone, nor can they bridge alone all the knowledge gaps that make projects successful. Working in partnership is the only solution, and I am pleased to report that we have achieved progress on climate finance in 2022. MDBs have already delivered on their collective targets that were set in 2019. In 2021, in terms of volume, we have provided $51 billion for climate finance in low and middle income countries, in a sharp increase compared with the previous year, including actually 19 billion for adaptation that were committed to low and middle income countries. The amount of global finance, private finance, that is mobilized in 2021 stands at $41 billion. We issued a joint MDB statement just ahead of the COP. It includes stepping up efforts to support countries and cities in their long-term climate planning, to help them prepare high-impact projects and programs that can deliver transformational results. We are doing so by mobilizing additional financing from both public and private sources. We are also supporting clients to better understand climate risks and build resilient, low-carbon and inclusive infrastructure, cities and business. And we are integrating our efforts to address the climate crisis with a growing focus on nature and biodiversity loss. In response to the call for enhanced upstream policy support, the multilateral development banks are working on a joint MDB LTS, long-term strategy facility, to be funded by high-income donor support. This would allow us to scale up our joint response to increasing demand from our countries of operation for long-term strategies and NDC support. We could better address climate adaptation needs for more vulnerable countries and regions, and mitigation and just transition needs in high emissions environments. Let me say a word on what we do at the European Investment Bank as the EU Climate Bank. At the EIB, we have been playing our part. We are transforming ourselves to be the climate bank of the European Union. We are one of the world's largest climate financiers. We have pioneered the green bond markets 15 years ago and have adopted ambitious climate targets since 2010. And 2 years ago, we have decided in our climate bank roadmap to embark on in climate and environment sustainability by 2025 to more than 50% of our lending annually, to support 1 trillion of green financing in the critical decade to 2030, and to align all our new activities and projects with the Paris Agreement, which is effective since January 2021. The share of EIB investment that went to climate and environment has risen to 51% in 2021. We have still a long way to go when it comes to climate, but the results show that the bank is transforming fast in order to meet our climate commitments. With the creation of EIB Global, a dedicated development arm of the EIB, we will make an even stronger contribution to climate action outside of the European Union. Just a couple of hours ago, together with other multilateral development banks and DFIs, EIB Global signed a contribution of $75 million to Alcazar Energy Partners II, an equity fund investing in renewable energy projects in the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. This is coupled with a $25 million investment by the Emerging Markets Climate Action Fund, MCAF, that was launched in Glasgow, and that is an excellent example of a concrete, innovative, and market-led approach to mobilizing private investment for climate-relevant infrastructure and to enhance multilateral finance and collaboration. I will close by saying that we are taking a close look at the G20 report on the capital adequacy framework of MDBs and the recommendations from the independent high-level expert group that were released here at COP by Nick Stern and Vera Songwe. We hope to be able to discuss this very soon with our boards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now have the last icebreaker intervention by Minister of Environment and Energy from Costa Rica, His Excellency Franz Tatembar Capra. Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, I welcome this long-term dialogue, long-term finance dialogue. And we recognize that global climate financial flows have increased significantly during the past decade. However, note that the 100 billion threshold has never been reached. Adaptation funding, though, is the main gap that requires to be acknowledged and addressed with respect to the delivery of this goal. There is a need of additional public grant-based finance for adaptation to reduce vulnerabilities to the adverse effects of climate change and enhance the resilience to minimize future impacts. Loans cannot continue to be the one and main source to mobilize finance. Costa Rica recently borrowed $700 million from the IMF just to cover the impact of recent events of climate change this year. Yes, there are nice terms. Yes, there are concessional loans. There are loans nonetheless to make our economy more resilient. Things are getting very urgent. We call on our developed country counterparts to demonstrate tangible and credible progress towards delivering the $600 billion cumulative by 2025. For Costa Rica, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement has a direct link to long-term finance agenda. After all, the $100 billion goal is itself a financial flow, and so when allocating and mobilizing resources, this must be consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse emissions and climate-resilient development. We should maybe start building a link between the shortfall in action and the financial flows extra that will be required for both loss and damage and adaptation. The 100 billion goal represents an insufficient one and a smaller amount than the actual misuse. The opposite. We have a tax on fossil fuels of the order of 30% to discourage consumption. Therefore, we can call, and we have funded most of our reduction in emissions from our agro industries and our landscapes and our forestry based on that green tax or green subsidy. Therefore, we call on developed countries to ensure that the money they mobilize in Paris align towards achieving the 1.5% world. We must remember also that we are here for all humanity and the planet, but we are here working for those people who are at the front lines, receiving the direct impacts of climate crisis. Costa Rica now is a member of the OECD, joint member of the OECD. It's kind of like a statement that we are coming out the middle income levels of development, and we're going back now with climate change. Costa Rica is getting hit directly for the last 2, 3, 4 years with tremendous impact, tremendous cost on the economy. And do we have a kind of a global insurance to cover for this? Are we being covered for this in a solidarity way? But you know, we pay our dues too. We are complying with our NDCs. We have done our fair share. We put NDC that were ambitious, and we are taking actions towards them. So, for this reason, for Costa Rica, we want to echo the words of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The impacts of climate change are, at their essence, impacts on full employment, enjoyment of all human rights. We reaffirm the importance of implementing ambitious human rights-based climate measures across all the topics: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance. All human rights compliance is essential to ensure sustainability and effectiveness of the provision, mobilization and allocation of climate finance, including the 100 billion goal and the new collective quantified goal on climate finance should be part of it. Thank you, and I look forward to the rich discussion this afternoon.
Thank you very much for the good interventions. Your Excellencies, this completes our list of icebreakers, and therefore I would now like to open our discussions. My co-moderator and I look forward to what we hope will be an engaging interaction amongst you, Excellencies. I will shortly invite you to take the floor to make interventions of 2 minutes in light of the limited time available, and I am sure high interest in engaging in these vital deliberations. Seeing that this is meant to be a dialogue, we would like to invite you to engage with each other. So if you may wish to intervene in response to another intervention, please do not hesitate to raise your flag again. This is meant to be a conversational dialogue after all. Parties and observers are also invited to submit a longer written statement if they wish to do so, which will be published on the UNFCCC website and engage on the central elements in their interventions today. This way, maybe we can stick to the 2 minutes intervention time and allow for a more interactive discussions and active engagement today. To reiterate, in your interventions, we would like to invite you to address the guiding questions that we introduced earlier, but also to respond to each other and engage on the issues raised by your fellow excellencies. My co-moderator and I very much look forward to what I'm sure will be a lively discussion. With this, I would now like to invite representatives of parties and observer organizations to start the interactive discussion, and would really like to call upon you to engage with each other as much as possible in your intervention. To request the floor, please raise your flag, and we would start with Pakistan, UK. Pakistan, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairs. We've had some exciting presentations, but since the time is short, Pakistan has made it very clear that we would like core issues of adaptation financing to be placed front and center of priorities in terms of building some level of resilience for countries like ours that are now facing climate shocks that are absolutely out of any calculations. We faced 33 million impacted just from the floods this year. And discussions on loss and damages were one hope that we had in terms of at least announcing a facility at the COP27, but we are told that it goes forward into a discussion on processes. So with those words, I'm going to go forward with a few more thoughts. One is that in terms of lessons learned from the 100 billion that has not been dispersed, that development finance institutions must also be retooled. They need to be rewired to deal with the needs that are escalating and absolutely rechanging the landscape, the financial and development and rights landscape of the 21st century as climate change hurtles towards new devastations that we face. So, Mr. President, we also want to say that there is urgent and immediate need for new, additional, predictable, and adequate financial resources to assist developing countries in meeting the rising costs of economic and non-economic losses and damages. Pakistan, for instance, has just incurred $30 billion of loss and damages, $30 billion of loss and damages just from one climate event. And these are World Bank estimates, and there is absolutely no capacity in the current financial system to meet those needs or to get at least even 15 million people out of the 33 on their feet, off the ground, for the winter that is coming, to keep them out of tarpaulins. There is a clear realization that we are not contributors to the global warming that is leading to this. We are less than 1%. So the work programs that have been established need to move forward with more clarity and direction. As the agenda on new collective quantified goals advances through the expert dialogues, technical expert dialogues, it must focus on the following 5 aspects. One is that this must be embedded in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and subsequent agreements. In particular, the finance for climate must be new and additional financing resources to meet the agreed full costs incurred by developing country parties and ensure adequacy and predictability to the flow of funds. Second, lack of agreement on what amount of USD 100 billion has been delivered stems from no agreed definition of climate finance. This must be addressed meaningfully, and we feel that it has been mentioned here, but it is another can that keeps getting kicked down the road in the name of process. We must seek to resolve this. Climate finance must also be channelized through the UNFCCC financial system as established by Article 11 of the Convention, providing financial resources on a grant basis. Again, that has been discussed here, and we are finding that most of the IFIs are now, as well as the green finance, most of the IFIs are now disbursing funds that were supposed to be grant funds in the name of green or climate financing or resilience financing, all emerging as heavy debts. Some of it is concessional, but thirdly, we also feel that the Standing Committee, the report produced by the Standing Committee on Climate Finance, is quite exhaustive, but there is no clarity on the actual disbursement of flows. We therefore we would urge the Secretariat to produce an executive summary of the report with more clarity on climate finance disbursements, basically where they're going. And lastly, the quantum and needs for the new goal item stems from Decision 53 of the Paris Agreement, where parties decided that prior to 2025, the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties of the Paris Agreement, shall set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of 100 billion per year, taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. Needs and priorities have not really been accounted for in any close to any of the losses and damage incurred on the ground. And we are finding that if it's aggregated through the UNFCCC itself, it will be important to base that quantification in alignment with the quantum of needs. There's been a lot of talk about the gap between needs and resources, but the prioritization of adaptation, the financing and the capitalization of an adaptation fund is an absolute necessity, and there will be a great deal of disappointment in outcomes if the COP27 does not even announce a basic loss and damage facility. With those words, I thank you.
Thank you very much. And next, UK.
Thank you very much, Chair. Colleagues, good afternoon. I think we can all agree that finance is absolutely central to delivering on what we agreed in Paris, what we agreed in the Glasgow Climate Pact, and ultimately to keep 1.5 alive. And I've said this before, and I repeat again, that without finance being deployed at scale, a lot of what we're trying to do is going to be well nigh impossible. And we had a discussion a few days ago. We talked about the need for the private sector to be mobilized, off public money, to try and get these trillions that we keep talking about into the system. That is what is going to make the real difference at the end of the day. It is not going to be just public money. But having said that, I know that the 100 billion figure is absolutely totemic. We didn't get there in 2020, and I completely understand developed countries receiving criticism for that. We know from the OECD figures we got to 83 billion. We need to do more. That's why we set out a delivery plan last year. I want to thank our friends in the German and Canadian government for the work they did last year, the update report this year, which shows that we're on track to get to the 100 billion by 2023. And of course, very importantly also, we need to ensure that what we all committed to as developed countries to double adaptation finance by 2025 is again something that we stay on track with. The quantum is one thing, the other is access to finance, and I hear this again and again from countries. Access to finance is absolutely vital. So the UK and Fiji has led a task force on access to finance. It's been operationalized. We've got 5 country pilots underway. Funding has been mobilized to support Rwanda to build their national approach to access. There's a new climate finance hub in Uganda, and we must continue to deepen these partnerships. The other thing that's really important is to track the progress. So when we talk about money, are we actually delivering? And that's why the work that we did last year on the Enhanced Transparency Framework is going to be very important in terms of better tracking and reporting on finance as well. And then, of course, we need to look beyond the $100 billion goal. And I'm particularly pleased that parties are now converging on a goal that is both quantitative as well as qualitative. And we are seeing a growing consensus, you're hearing this already, around the need for a transformative shift in the international financial architecture as well. And I was at the World Bank annual meetings, and I said in the margins that we can't tackle the defining challenge of this century, tackling climate change, with institutions that ultimately were defined by the last. And so we will continue to be committed to this agenda. From a UK perspective, Prime Minister Sunak was here last week. He reiterated our commitment to delivering 11.6 billion in international climate finance, including that balance between mitigation and adaptation, and also tripling our adaptation finance by from 2019 levels to 1.5 billion in 2025. I could go on, friends, but time is short, so I just want to say this. Ultimately, finance is going to make or break all of the work that we are doing, and of course our ability to keep 1.5 alive. The 100 billion is totemic, it's got to be delivered. We need to ensure we deliver on access to finance, and we need an ambitious post-2025 goal as well, and that reform of the international financial system. I hope we can see much of this reflected in the cover decisions that come out of this COP. Thank you.
Thank you, UK. I now have Tuvalu, followed by Timor-Leste and Norway.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and I do recognize and congratulate colleague Minister Sharma from the Maldives for your leadership. The scale of finance currently available is appalling. We are not even close to meeting the 1.5-degree goal when it comes to finance. We need to scale up climate finance dramatically, particularly in doubling of adaptation finance. Non-economic loss and damage from climate and weather extremes are increasingly driving displacement in all regions, with small island states disproportionately affected. But crucially and particularly the low-lying atoll sovereign nations, such as my country, Tuvalu. Without climate action, crucially on an agreement for a dedicated facility for loss and damage under the Framework Convention here at COP27, we could be seeing the last generation of children to grow up in Tuvalu. The experts and the IPCC working group report are telling us that, one, there are gaps in existing funding arrangements, particularly under the Convention to addressing loss and damage. And secondly, there is an urgent and immediate need for new, additional, adequate and predictable financial resources to assist developing countries to meet the cost of the ex-post responses to loss and damage. Tuvalu therefore supports the call for a loss and damage response fund to be designated as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the Convention under Article 11 to be created at this COP. Tuvalu supports the call for a process such as an ad hoc committee to assess options for funding arrangement for addressing loss and damage. In particular, through the designation of an entity as an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the Convention under Article 11. We need a strong political statement that shows the world we are up to the task of the urgent action in this critical moment. In fact, this occurred with the GCF, whereby a political decision was made in 2010 to establish a fund, and its governance and operational modalities were worked out subsequently before the GCF became operational many years later. And we see very similar parallels with the Loss and Damage Response Fund, where we can agree to set up a response fund for loss and damage at this COP and commit over the next 2 years to a process to develop the governance and operational modalities. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister from Tuvalu. Timor-Leste.
Thank you very much, co-chairs. I'll just go straight to the point, really. From Timor-Leste, we are a an LDC, we are a seat member state, so we are struggling against an uphill battle. But in the last 10 years or so, we have been having constant, repetitious problems and natural disasters that are costing us a lot of money. Almost every year, we are spending over hundreds of millions of dollars just trying to fix the destroyed infrastructures and the livelihoods of the citizens. And we have been losing lives in the last decades or so. So this is a serious concern. And now, what we need to do, we know that Timor-Leste is a small island state. We are relying on petroleum, fossil fuel as our source of income, but we would like to diversify and we would like to end that dependency. So we offer, my president, President Ramos Horta, has offered an option. That option, the possibility was Timor-Leste would be willing to leave the fossil fuel underground if there is a viable financing opportunity to make that possible. So we will be willing not to touch that fossil fuel. Now, the other option would be to diversify our economy. And diversification of Timorese economy would also be depending on a friendlier climate, because we can be a great tourism destination, but with bleaching and the rising of temperature, it seems like we have very little options in this life presently. So therefore, I think all these discussions about financing, of all of these discussions about possibilities or avenues through which we can really finance development, we just hope that they can really be meaningful and make real sense in fixing real-life problems that countries such as ours are facing. And these are real problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we have Norway, followed by China, and followed by Argentina. And Norway, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I want to join all those voices who have underlined the need for actually reaching 100 billion. It's incredibly important for the credibility of this overall process that we actually work towards that. Norway announced already in Glasgow that we would strive to double our climate finance over a 5-year period, up to 1.6 billion, and we want to continue to be a leader in making this happen and to actually contribute to reaching the goal that we set together, which I think is important in itself, but also important in order to maintain the credibility of the developing countries when we have other asks for the rest of the world. My second point is that we need to use all money smartly. We need to make sure that we have good and effective channels, that money is used smartly in the sense that there are institutional arrangements that make them work well. That goes for mitigations. It's also true for adaptation, where we very much support the development of strong and science-based national adaptation plans, because we need to ensure that the money that is allocated to adaptation actually adapts and leads to better preparedness in the future. And this will also be true as we now, thankfully, endeavor into understanding what the loss and damage finance will be, how it will be organized, how it will be collected, how it will be channeled. We really need a serious discussion now on how the finance is best used. Then I also would like to underline that while we clearly need public money, grants for this, we also need to mobilize the trillions. And maybe one of the most important tasks we have now is to come together to find good ways to do exactly that. I want to share with you that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the NBIM, Norges Bank Investment Management, now has a net zero plan and also a biodiversity ask for all the companies it owns. It owns 1.5% of all the stocks in the world. It controls $1.3 trillion. And that was also a major contribution to send a signal to institutional investors that they also need to take a clear role in making sure that more money is moving into the right direction. That's part of this big story, and I think we really need to now come together and make sure that we very soon arrive at 100 billion. 83 point something is not good enough. We have to deliver on our promises, and we will do our part.
Thank you very much. And next, China.
谢谢主席。众所周知，巴黎协定明确规定，发达国家应履行公约现有义务，为发展中国家减缓和适应气候变化提供资金支持。COP26期间，各方重申有关共识，继续在公约框架下讨论长期资金议题。对此，中方表示欢迎。长期资金事关发达国家持续向发展中国家提供资金支持的政治意愿，中方支持长期资金在公约及其巴黎协定政治共识下长期存在，为各方沟通交流气候资金议题提供重要的平台。针对主席提出的4个问题，中方有下面3点意见：第一，发达国家未能如期落实2020年前每年1000亿美元气候资金目标，不仅损害了多边气候治理的政治互信，也阻碍了发展中国家应对气候变化的努力。
And face climate changes. And via COP26, this reaffirms what we have reached in this regard. And in order to continue our dialogue about climate finance in the long run, we should take more concrete measures. China welcomes these dialogues, and that the finance provided by advanced countries to developing countries in the long run is directly linked to political views. China concurs with the agreements reached in the Paris agreements. The Paris Agreement was considered a very important platform for exchanging points of view and dialogue in terms of financing climate change. In this regard, we have different points of view in this regard. First is that developed countries, in case that they are not able to reach the $100 billion target, will not be able to fulfill their promises and did not fulfill the promises starting 2020. Accordingly, this has had negative repercussions on political confidence from all parties. And in order to tackle the issue of climate finance, then we have to reach this goal. This has led to the hindrances of developing country in dealing with the climate change and facing this grave challenge. Developed countries need to analyze the reasons leading to the inability to achieve the 100 billion target in order to have the best lessons learned.
Followed by EU and India.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I'm speaking today on behalf of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Let me begin by expressing our appreciation and full support to the Egyptian COP27 presidency. Since the end of COP26, we have been hearing that 2022 would mark the beginning of the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. If it is true that we have successfully finished the Paris Rule Book with the decision on Article 6, it does not seem to be the case for other topics on the agenda. In our view, climate financing is a key enabler of the fulfillment of the objective of the UNFCCC and the goals of its Paris Agreement. The success of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh will mostly depend on our ability to deliver on this matter. We need a clear and comprehensible update of the international finance architecture. The actual amount of resources feels short from expected up until 2021. It has focused largely on mitigation to the detriment of adaptation activities. And on the other hand, financial flows have been geographically concentrated in North America, Europe, and some parts of Asia. Developing countries still face many challenges related to access modalities in bilateral and multilateral funds, strenuous accreditation and disbursement processes, as well as the unjustified use of loan as the primary instrument for the provision of climate finance. For that, we need that the new fund to be established to address loss and damage finance provides accessible, predictable, and expedient disbursement to all developing countries with new and additional resources, in particular to ODA. We also need that commitment of developed countries to at least double climate finance for adaptation by 2025 is fully delivered in a transparent, traceable manner and with resources that are additional to current pledge and commitments and mostly channeled through the Adaptation Fund. On the $100 billion per year commitment, after COP26 there is a clear consensus that developed countries have been repeatedly failing in their mobilization efforts. Developed countries also promise to increase their ambition through a delivery plan whereby the $100 billion per year commitment will be met by 2023. So far, even with the recent publication of its progress report, the plan continues to build upon platitudes since so far there is no clear roadmap for its implementation, including information on how each developed country will contribute to a share of the mobilization of $100 billion per year by 2023. We expect that by the end of 2023, developed countries will have not only delivered on the $100 billion for that year, but also provide the corresponding amount from at least 2020-2022 that were not fulfilled. It is important that developed countries increase on the next years of this commitment the share of grant-based resources provided. Here at COP27, we expect developed countries to step up and present concrete solutions to this commitment, promoting at last the transparency needed to rebuild trust and discussion on climate finance. ABU believes that to enhance and improve transparency of the information provided, it is of utmost importance for us to agree under the UNFCCC on a common definition on climate finance. One thing we know for sure is that we should learn from the failure to deliver on the broken $100 billion promise when setting the new collective quantified goal on climate finance under the ad hoc work program initiated at COP26. ABU's view, Mr. President, the core elements of the discussion for us, among others, are the NCQG is a commitment of developed countries. It should provide new and additional resources. It should be based on the historic emission of developed countries, equity, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It should build on clear share and contribution from each developed country. It should acknowledge the role of the private sector as complementary to public finance, which continues to be essential to support climate action in developing countries, in particular for adaptation. The NCQG should promote mainly grant-based instruments, avoiding the exacerbation of indebtedness in developing countries, but also allowing for creative solutions and innovative instruments, including climate for debt swaps and payment for ecosystem services, among others. It should be focused on adaptation, loss and damage apart from mitigation. It should be based on the needs and priorities of developing countries that nowadays represent trillions of dollars. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you, Argentina. If I may now request the European Union to make an intervention.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying that sadly, it is a fact that the $100 billion goal has not been achieved. It's really a matter of credibility and commitment. The European Union is committed. We have contributed $27 billion and 54% of that commitment is spent on adaptation and cost-cutting projects. And we call upon all developed countries to increase their contributions and deliver on their commitments. All donors should continue being transparent on this delivery of finance, including on how we're taking forward the 10 collective actions identified in the delivery plan. We must create the conditions both to mobilize climate finance corresponding to the scale and nature of the challenges that all countries, in particular the most vulnerable countries, face, and we must do this with greater efficiency and effectiveness. It's true. The scale, as the representative of Argentina said, the scale of the transition is high and trillions will be needed, and there is not enough public money to foot that bill. So we need to make sure we create the right conditions also for private money to come in. So targeting climate finance to where it is needed most, including for adaptation in the most vulnerable countries, is crucial, including access to finance for those countries with limited technical capacity, weak financial system, or a risk profile that discourage private investments. Because markets won't do this automatically, so we have to provide the right conditions. Within the 100 billion goal for climate finance, there is a need and an urgency to increase the amount of adaptation finance and correspond to what we all agreed in Glasgow. So we need to recognize that there are barriers to access to adaptation finance, and we need to lower those barriers, especially for the LDCs and the SIDS. And I think the transition that is needed is first and foremost about the health and well-being of all people, and it therefore has to be a just transition, otherwise there will be no transition. It's a global objective, and I want to point to the increasingly successful just energy transition partnerships. Last week, South Africa's investment plan. We're moving forward with a number of countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, India and Senegal. But we also have to understand that to reach our Paris goals, it is crucial to unlock private investment through the right conditions and introducing innovative financial instruments. So we all have to work together to put in place policies that offer the signals and the incentives to the private sector to support the global transition and the right amounts of public funding that were promised. And please allow me now to pass the floor to the presidency of the Council of Ministers, Czechia.
Thank you very much. From the position of the EU Council, let me assure that EU and its member states are firm on their commitment to contribute to meeting the collective annual 100 billion goal as soon as possible, together with other provider countries. Nowadays, the EU and its 27 member states are the largest contributor to the international public climate finance, contributing over 23 billion euro in 2021, which means almost double in comparison with 2013. We call on all contributing countries to urgently deliver on their climate finance as seen in the Climate Finance Delivery Plan, and welcome new announcements made over the course of the year and the past days here at COP27. To conclude, I would like to stress that we have come to Sharm el-Sheikh as all other parties, hopefully, with a commitment to maintain momentum on keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, and encourage further ambitions and implementation in this critical decade. Therefore, we are deeply disappointed that the parties did not accept the EU's request to even formally discuss how to make finance flows consistent with the mitigation and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. We know this is a missed opportunity for all of us. Thank you very much for
Thank you very much, and we move forward to India, followed by Mauritius and followed by Bolivia. India.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, access to finance and technology in developing countries is a must-have if we expect to protect our Earth and ourselves from apocalyptic changes. The commitment made by the developed countries to mobilize 100 billion from diverse sources by 2020 was a major amount and remains unachieved till now. The current need of developing countries are estimated to be in the order of trillions. There are several estimates of climate finance. The OECD estimate the flows to be USD 83.3 billion in 2020 and USD 79.9 billion in 2018. While Oxfam estimate the mobilized amount to be USD 19 to 22.5 billion per year in 27-28. Other estimates from UNFCCC and are USD 45.4 billion in 2017 and USD 51.8 billion in 2018. Evidently, there is no understanding of what really comprises climate finance. Transparency and trust are the backbones of all multilateral discussions. Having a clear definition of climate finance will promote transparency and trust, vital for furthering constructive deliberations. While we take note of the work carried out by the Standing Committee on Finance, there is need to further work in arriving at a meaningful definition of climate finance. High transaction cost for accessing project preparation, grants, and considerable co-financing requirement from the developing country need to be addressed. Slow disbursement, lack of flexibility to adapt to changing requirement, the long complex approval procedure with stringent eligibility criteria make difficult access to climate finance difficult. It is not the absence of a bankable project pipeline, but the procedures, inflexibility in approach, and lack of trust with respect to direct access entities that is the problem. The new collective quantified goal for the period post-2025 needs to be an ambitious mobilization target at grant concessional terms. We require an ambitious flow of financial resources from various sources, public and private, with the developed countries playing a pivotal role in incentivizing flows to the developing countries so that the finance, the key means of implementation, is at grant concessional rates. The nationally determined contributions and the need determination report could be a good basis to estimate the requirement. We are also of the view that action to improve the functioning of the financial mechanism to enable access is also critical. There is only a small window of opportunity to rectify a problem that has accumulated over the centuries. It is really time for concerted action if we want to curtail temperature rise to sustain life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we move forward to Mauritius and followed by Bolivia. Mauritius.
Okay. Excellencies, climate change is a single most critical survival challenge for Mauritius. While we have stated this several times, it still deserves iteration in this August forum. While the world around us continues to debate and procrastinate on climate actions, Mauritius and other small island developing states are already suffering disproportionate consequences of not acting enough to address the ill effects of climate change while contributing insignificantly to it. Mauritius notes that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is not being adhered to in its entirety by the developed world. Pledges made remain unfulfilled, commitments made are dishonored, action promised are delayed, while during this time, we, along with other SIDS and developing countries, continue to walk down a path of no return. Madam President, adaptation to climate change is our immediate challenge. We can no longer afford to see adaptation as different from sustainable development. We therefore urge the international community to understand that adaptation and development for Mauritius and other SIDS are conjunctive, and an artificial divide between adaptation and development action is counterproductive. We solemnly note that in spite of this urgency promised, international support has not been forthcoming. Onerous requirements for establishing our vulnerability and adaptation needs have been imposed on us, whereas it is acknowledged in all scientific as well as policy literature that SIDS are disproportionately vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Mauritius, along with other SIDS, strongly urge the international community to consider adaptation funding instead to be automatically eligible for grant-based financing in consideration of our inherent and exacerbating vulnerabilities. In this context, we welcome the recently introduced seeds-specific finance opportunity made available through the SCCF, but at the same time propose an unconditional adaptation grant mechanism be operationalized at the earliest. We have committed to unconditional implementation of 35% of our NDC targets. We do not consider this a just commitment given our contribution of less than 0.01% to climate change, but we nevertheless stand by it. We are making every effort to systematically enhance our climate spending through incorporation of climate-sensitive planning and budgeting in our national budgets and incentivizing the private sector to commit to enhance climate financing. We are seeking and will continue to seek innovative financing mechanisms to enable us to meet this commitment. We welcome any support, technical or financial, from the international community in developing such innovative finance mechanisms such as green and blue bonds, debt for climate swaps, and so on. For this 65% conditional finance to implement our NDC, Mauritius seeks non-market-based financing to finance our NDC targets. The present funding mechanisms are cumbersome, extremely time-consuming with onerous demands on resources, and are driven by agenda and capability of limited number of specific entities. We urge that the climate finance mechanism be replaced by simpler, nationally guided mechanisms, which will allow for timely and predictable flow of finance. In the same line, I conclude, we urge the international community to consider climate vulnerability as the criterion for concessional finance through a non-climate financing mechanisms instead of GDP, GNI. With these words, I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. If I may now request Bolivia to make an intervention, followed by Australia and UN Capital Development. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias. Bolivia realiza esta intervención a nombre del grupo de países que conforman el LMDC. Pues la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas.
For all the countries that represent us, well, the UNFCCC has covered the climate funding as well as the Kyoto and Paris conventions. They all have covered the international framework to speak about the climate crisis and also the implementation in COP27. All forms of implementation and also funding and the transformation of technology from the developed countries to the developing countries is key in order to stand in the face of climate change. All efforts exerted by the developed countries that have been the main source of emissions and climate change always keeps our dialogue aback in terms of climate change, especially on the funding given to developing countries. While we still need to discuss our commitments in the developing countries to the private sector. Private sector funding in terms of Article 2.5c is not commensurate with the agreement or the convention. That is why it is not good for the developing countries, which leads to adverse reactions, especially for developing countries in terms of access to funds to counter climate change. Developing countries have to receive enough amounts of funds to bridge this gap and to recover from the loss and damage, and we have to reach a definition for climate funding, especially in terms of access to results that are important, and we have to speak about instruments for funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I may now request Australia to make an intervention.
Thank you, Excellencies. Distinguished colleagues, Australia is pleased to attend this 5th high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance. Climate finance plays a critical role in supporting developing countries to transition to a clean energy and climate-resilient future. Australia recognises the importance of the collective $100 billion goal for climate finance. Australia is committed to reaching this goal, and we express our disappointment that it was not met in 2020. Australia is on track to meet our doubled climate finance commitment made at COP26 of $2 billion over the period from 2020 to 2025. At least $700 million of this will be used to build climate and disaster resilience in the Pacific. And this will be further boosted, including through a new commitment to increase Australia's official development assistance to the Indo-Pacific by $1.4 billion over 4 years. Australia is focused on deploying high-quality climate finance to meet the needs of our developing country partners, including in the Pacific. Climate finance must deliver outcomes on the ground, and for climate finance to be effective, it must be tailored, fit for purpose and country-led. The $100 billion goal represents only a small proportion of what is required to shift the trillions to support the transformation to a net zero, climate-resilient global economy. This would require our collective efforts, public, private, domestic and international. And the scale of the challenge is immense, and we must catalyse finance from all potential sources. We must make every dollar count. And in this regard, we call on our multilateral development banks to increase the proportion of funding spent on climate, and to ensure that this is done in ways that are effective and which don't add to already high levels of indebtedness. Australia welcomed the COP26 decision to create a 3-year work program to establish a new global climate finance goal. We look forward to working closely, constructively with all parties and stakeholders to ensure an ambitious outcome at COP29 in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we have UN Capital Development, followed by Indonesia and followed by Gambia. UN Capital Development, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. I'd just like to share 3 points with parties. So the UN Capital Development Fund is the United Nations catalytic financing entity for the least developed countries and other nations. And our job is to work with parties to pilot and test out financing mechanisms that can be taken to scale. So what are the lessons we've learned? I think just 3 very quick points over the last decade of working in climate finance. First, and it's been mentioned by many, we need increased direct access, simpler ways of accessing the various funds out there, and a recognition that projects alone are not going to solve the problem. Whether it's adaptation or mitigation, not everything can be projectized. Therefore, we also need, and many have also referred to this, financing mechanisms, financing systems, whether public or private, that provide long-term predictable finance. And in fact, under the non-market approaches, under Article 6.8 in the negotiations, there are a number of those that are already in embryonic form and perhaps could be taken forward. So direct access and speeded up access to the various project funds for blending that exist, such as GCF, adaptation, etc., plus mechanisms for longer term continual finance. I think another element that has been learned, particularly when it comes to adaptation, but not only adaptation, is that adaptation is inherently local, and cities and towns and regions play a major role in least developed countries and elsewhere in driving the climate finance forward. And to that extent, I'd like to congratulate UN Habitat and Egypt, the host country, for the initiative on the 17th of this month of bringing together for the first time at COP the ministers responsible for cities or urbanization or local government, whatever they are called in each country, together with the COP ministries under the hosted by Egypt, and that's the first time that we've seen the cities and the regions, which are also key in terms of delivering finance, particularly adaptation finance, coming to the table at the COP. So thank you, Egypt, for that initiative, and thank you very much indeed, Chair.
Thank you very much. And next we have Indonesia.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Indonesia would like to give a strong emphasis that developed country parties need to fulfill their commitment on the goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion per year for developing country parties. This is essential to actually make progress for climate action in developing country parties, and also important to rebuild the trust that we need in international collaboration. Secondly, Indonesia would like to appreciate the report of Standing Committee on Finance on the 5th biennial assessment. Indonesia notes the challenges encountered by the SGF in making this report. However, Indonesia wants to raise some concern about that report. First, the amount, the 5th BA public climate finance flow from developed to developing countries indeed increased a little in 2019 to 2020 compared to 2017 to 2018, but it's only reaches 40.1 billion per year on average. This is still far away from committed 100 billion per year. In terms of global finance flow, 5th BA mentioned that global climate finance flow were 12% higher in 2019 up to 2020 than in 2017 to 2018, reaching an annual average of 803 billion. This is still too far from the needs of 5.8 up to 5.9 trillion until 2030, based on 153 NDCs of developing country parties, as stated in the SGF first report on the determination of need of developing country parties. Second, issue regarding access, the need to address access barrier arising from the complex multilateral climate finance architectures. Third, the issue of need. The flow of global climate finance is relatively small compared to the needs of developing countries. And fourth, issue of balance. More public funding flows from developed countries to developing countries are aim of mitigation rather than adaptation. Indonesia expects those challenges can be resolved with the aim to fulfillment of the commitment in 2023 at the latest. In this specific opportunity, Indonesia stresses on the issues of access, because even the funding exists, but developing countries have difficulty to access that fund. A simpler process, less burdensome requirements are needed to accelerate the access of the fund. On the challenges in the $100 billion is not merely the number, but also on tracking to see how far the existing funding flows have been achieved. SGF in its report has raised that one of the challenges is the issue of tracking and reporting climate finance, including the indicators. This is also related of the issue of transparency. It is expected the new reporting table will increase the information on climate finance submitted by the parties. Once again, Indonesia like to reiterate the developed nation must fulfill their commitment on climate finance for developing countries. Mobilizing the trillions needed in developing countries require concrete commitment and action, and developed countries need to lead this effort. Be mindful of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Progress can only be made if sufficient finance for climate action in order to avoid catastrophic impacts of climate change in the future. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. If I may now request Gambia to make an intervention, followed by Sudan and Ghana.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for all the contributors. I think we all agree that we are all sitting on a time bomb. And therefore, it is very urgent that we act, and we act smartly and now. Climate change is affecting all of us, just that it is in different ways. But as a developing country, the Gambia, we didn't just look into our size, but we took up the bold step to lead the call to global actions and presented an accurate NDC that is in line with the Paris Agreement. But now we have challenge on implementing this. So are we just having the document and without implementing? Are we sure that we are going to attain our objective for 2030? The Gambia, just 1 meter sea rise would send our capital below sea level. And we submitted a project on the coastal zone management under the Green Climate Fund since 2018. And up till now, we are not clear as to our fate. And that will send me back to the speakers that reiterated on the need for a clear pattern of accessing these funds. The time limits, the criteria needs to be very transparent so that each and every one of us would have and know what to put forward, and also the time limit expected. Otherwise, the 2030 objective is not going to be feasible for all of us to attain. And that's not fair to most of us. Coming to the climate finance, the conditions that are attached to this finance need to be very clear. For example, the Gambia is already battling with a high debt on their GDP. So having an additional condition on this financing, that will incur some little bit of debt, or even without being very clear as to how the grant is going to be invested on, is just going to solve one problem but give us another problem. So that being the case, we want the conditions to be very clear. If we have been asked to respond to the global call and come up with ambitious targets to support the global actions to attaining the limit of the climate, the 1.5 degree, that being the case, there should be a strong condition attached to how to also implement these NDCs. Otherwise, we'll just have written documents without any actions. And I don't think we will all allow to run around climate impact just as we ran around COVID-19. Climate impact is affecting the Gambia. We are already battling with loss and damages. And we are already been forced to use from our meager resources to respond to this. And again, if the NDC is being left only for us to battle with from our meager resources, that is just sinking us deeper into the poverty line. And that's not fair. So therefore, as a country, developing country, I call for a much stronger spirit of solidarity. The justice part of it is a very, very critical debate, but I think building on the strength of solidarity needs to be given priority. We need to contribute to support the NDCs. We need to contribute to make sure that we implement the long-term strategies to attain the most important agenda on this universe, which is the climate, the temperature reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Gambia. We will now have an intervention by Sudan, followed by Ghana.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. The Sudan is one of the most countries impacted by climate change. This has been very evident this year, where the floods and torrents have affected a lot of provinces in the Sudan, which were not impacted previously. Accordingly, and based on these floods and torrents, A lot of farms and agricultural lands as well as infrastructure was lost. In addition to that, we have lost a lot of lives. The losses that the Sudan has incurred as a result of these torrents has reached nearly 20 million US dollars. These losses are incurred, but should be incurred by the causing countries. Sudan was never a part of this climate change. Also, in the same year, other areas have been faced with drought. This has led to damages to the agricultural landscape, especially that 1/3 of the population in Sudan depend on agriculture. A lot of people lost their living because of this drought. This should be incurred by the countries leading or causing these climate change. Incurring costs that we were never a cause of is not fair. Also, in terms of financing, we call on not politicizing climate financing. What happened in Sudan currently is that climate finance is being politicized. Funding has stopped. Some funds have stopped fulfilling their obligations as a result of the changes that took place after the 25th of October. This has led to a lot of damages and repercussions to a lot of Sudanese where they were displaced from their areas of residence to other areas in order to look for a living. This has led to more stress on resources, more stress on grazing lands and agricultural lands, more stress between farmers, and conflicts arising between the population, in addition to the great damage in the agricultural land. A lot of forests have been flooded by the population in search of places of residence. This is because of the funds stopping to make payment. This is a moral obligation. Local communities need to live with dignity and need to have their bare minimum to sustain their living. We did not cause these losses and damages. They were caused by advanced economies, and they morally have to fulfill their financial obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we have Ghana, followed by Japan and Jordan. Ghana, go ahead.
Thank you for giving me the floor. It is with great sense of honor that I speak for Ghana, which now holds the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the CVF. The recently adopted Accra-Kinshasa communique of the CVF highlights key shared priorities developed with consultation with the members of the forum, and one of the key priorities is finance. Climate change has eliminated 1/5 of the wealth of the CVF countries over the last 2 decades. Initial evidence shows that these countries would have been 20% wealthier today had it not been for climate change and the losses it incurred for poor and vulnerable economies. The Delivery Plan Progress report released by Canada and Germany exposes the disparities in developed countries' climate finance efforts. Developed countries are still failing to meet their commitment to mobilize 100 billion in climate finance annually for developing countries, a promise made over a decade ago that was meant to be fulfilled by 2020. The transparency in this report is welcome, but it's not enough. At a time when developing countries urgently need resources to build resilience, developed countries are escaping their obligation. The new collective quantified goal on climate finance must be adequately needs-based in terms of scale and volume and respond to the needs of the most vulnerable developing countries, including but not excluding indebtedness. The NCQG must also consider a high and growing emphasis on grant-based funding for adaptation for developing countries, particularly vulnerable climate change, with the NCQC to scale up climate finance for developing countries and consider existing obligations of parties under the UNFCCC, learning from the experience of the yet unfulfilled 100 billion joint climate finance mobilization goal. We are also asking to secure a standalone implementation plan of COP26 agreed Dublin International Finance, and the UN's latest adaptation gap report released ahead of COP27 shows that developing works need some 5 to 10 times a fold increase in financial help to adapt to climate change. Excellencies, the CVF is united in the face of adversity by our vulnerability. Paradoxically, our vulnerability is also one of our greatest strengths. Our communities are finding innovative ways to adapt to climate change, and our global leadership is resulting in significant progress at the global level. Much of the progress of climate change would be impossible without our efforts. We are leading, and for that we should be proud. Together, we will move from vulnerability to prosperity. Together, our voices will resonate around the world. And I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And next we have Japan.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Given the time constraint, I'd like to speak on only some of the guiding questions. Regarding 100 billion US dollar goal, Japan has fulfilled its commitment, making 1.3 trillion Japanese yen both public and finance in 2020. It accounts for almost 12% of 100 billion US dollar goal on annual basis. However, the development countries as a whole has yet to achieve this joint goal. Here, I'd like to raise several reasons and answers for this. First, some attribute this failure to stagnant private climate finance. However, what we count in 100 billion US dollar goal is private finance mobilized by public finance. Private climate finance investments have evolved significantly over the past few years and do not require public finance support when the projects are bankable and the economic returns are expected. In the Southeast Asia, for example, many renewable energy power projects are already funded with private finance only. Therefore, we need to shift public climate finance to areas and countries where further private finance inflows can be expected from the public climate finance. Second, private finance flow to countries with socioeconomic stability and profitability to avoid country risk and exchange risk. Therefore, private climate finance investments are sporadic and do not flow evenly to all regions. To ensure that private finance flows to all developing countries, it is necessary to create innovative financial instruments that would incentivize private finance and mitigate risks. Third, more adaptation finance is needed as climate change worsens. But there is still misalignment between climate finance and development finance. Water, health, agriculture are three major themes for adaptations, but there is not a lot of talk about which projects in these areas are good example or good climate projects. So we need to explore best practices for adaptation and seek the nexus between development and finance, development and climate. To do this, we need to seek cooperation from multilateral development bank and international finance institutions. For next year, in 2023 and beyond, developed countries should further expedite their efforts to mobilize 100 billion US dollar goal. Japan remains committed to this joint effort. Last year, Japan announced support totaling 70 billion US dollar over 5 years from 2021 to 2025, or 14 billion US dollar per year. So 14% of this 100 billion US dollar annual goal. Our Prime Minister Kishida also announced at COP26 that of this commitment, Japan's support for adaptation will be doubled from the level of its previous commitment under ACE 2.0. The new amount for adaptation finance is approximately 14.8 billion US dollar in both public and private finance over the 5 years till 2025. Japan will steadily implement these commitments of climate finance, not just with words, but with actions. For example, this year, Japan, throughout UNDP, provided a total of $42 million in climate change assistance to 23 developing countries, including vulnerable countries. Also, Japan contributed $6 million to Adaptation Fund in 2022 and is considering making a new contribution very soon. Another difficult and emerging challenge is enhanced access to climate finance. In this regard, Green Climate Fund is working to simplify and harmonize application to the funds together with capacity building support in developing countries. We hope that this effort will lead to faster implementation of projects and greatly improve access to climate finance. We also need to ensure that climate finance provided contribute effectively to climate actions in developing countries. A new reporting system with an enhanced transparency framework could provide greater clarity on efficiency and effectiveness of climate finance. While developed countries are required to do this reporting work, developing countries will also be requested to report on climate finance they receive. Last but not least, I'd like to make one point regarding the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. As I mentioned at the outset, private finance is also working on its own economic and social transformation to achieve decarbonization. In future deliberations on NCQG, we need to take these new trends into account and reflect them into NCQG. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Japan, for the intervention. If I may now request Jordan to make an intervention, followed by Nigeria and Angola. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Jordan supports what many colleagues has called for today, that a balanced approach towards mitigation and adaptation should be in place, and asks for an acceleration and ease of access to finance with a priority given to grant support so that we don't further burden countries in need of this support with additional debt. More focus should be given to countries that are in climate hotspots and hosts of a large percentage of their population as refugees. In his speech at the Leaders' Summit, His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan launched the Climate Refugee Nexus Initiative. Countries like Jordan are bearing the brunt of climate change. Share per capita of water in Jordan is down to 20%, and waves of refugees over the past 10 years increased the population of Jordan by as much as 20%. We ask that you all endorse and support this very important initiative. It should be posted on the Presidency website with the list of the initiatives. I'm sure it is by now. Finally, we have called for a dashboard to be hosted by an agreed-to entity that logs the actual commitments, not pledges, of countries and what is being spent, tracks what is being spent, including countries receiving the support, to provide the opportunity to track the flow of funding and to exchange expertise and experiences with these countries that are receiving the funding. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Your Excellency. If I may now request Nigeria to make an intervention. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair and your team. Nigeria currently chairs the Pan-African Great Green Wall Initiative and therefore supports, one, the urgency of developed countries to implement their commitments under the Paris Agreement, the urgent need for developed country parties to provide scaled up, adequate, sustainable, predictable, new and additional financial resources, mainly from public sources, 3, the need for the provision of clarity on the levels of support, in particular financial support, that will be provided by developed country parties to developing country parties to allow for enhanced implementation of the Paris Agreement. The post-2025 mobilization goal must reflect the ambition, progression, and the collective agreement to stay well below 2 degrees and aspire to stay within the 1.5 degrees temperature goal. And therefore agree that the deliberations on quantum mobilization target should start from range of commitment by developed countries to mobilize jointly at least USD 1.3 trillion per annum by 2030, of which 50% for mitigation and 50% for adaptation, and a significant percentage on grant basis from a flow of USD 100 billion. So I agree completely with the submission by Oxfam that non-concessional loans should be eliminated from climate funds, from climate finance. So Nigeria specifically seeks the operationalization of the Glasgow policy pledges on finance, specifically for adaptation finance and the new financing mechanism of loss and damage. Increased support for the formulation and implementation of NAPs and NDCs. Further guidance should be given to the Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund on accelerated basis to access funding for readiness as well as for large-scale project proposals. Ensure the implementation of the new collective qualified goal target on financing. However, this should not excuse the inability of not meeting the target of $100 billion. A new specific financial instrument should be created for loss and damage and facilitate access to funds to finance technology action plan. Finally, there are expectations that adaptation finance flows mobilized to meet the current and future collective goal must be scaled up to ensure that vulnerable countries can meet their adaptation needs, reduce their vulnerability, and increase their resilience to cope with climate hazards such as floods and droughts. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. And next, the floor is for Angola, please. Sorry, very sorry about this. Philippines is the next one.
Philippines, right?
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, co-chairs. Good evening, colleagues, excellencies. There is a serious consideration to reflect how far we have come with regard to climate finance. We see the need to address the gaps and ensure predictability and clarity in the way we involve climate financing in our discussions here at COP and its actual mobilization. The Philippines believes that we need to agree on an operative definition of climate finance to guide upcoming reviews of the financial mechanisms. Discussions on accurate and transparent reporting of climate finance flows and generating figures for how much more is needed by least developing and climate vulnerable countries. In view of our experience with the unmet $100 billion per year target, the Philippines urges for the adoption of a transformational operational definition of climate finance to include the principles of or characteristics of the new collective quantified goal, covering both quantitative and qualitative elements, including effectiveness of sources of financing. The definition of climate finance should espouse accessibility, inclusivity, adequacy, effectivity, predictability, measurability, transparency, additionality, and responsiveness to the needs and priorities of the developing countries. The Philippines cannot overemphasize enough how critical it is for us to achieve concrete and practical implementation in COP27. The increasing intensity and frequency of climate and weather extremes, including more severe tropical cyclones we experience every year, are testaments to this urgency. Climate finance must take its way effectively and efficiently down to the national local level. The Philippines proposes for a delivery plan on achieving 100 billion that explicitly specifies the climate finance quality, accelerated focus on adaptation financing, scaling up climate finance grants, and streamlining access to financing. Lessons gathered from the delivery of the goal point us to the need to establish flexible grant funding for local and community-based urgent adaptation programs. The need to revise policies of international funds that are simple, flexible on co-financing, support innovative financial instruments, and tailoring capacity building of developing countries on overseeing and strengthening climate finance. There is a need to work on basing financial mechanisms with the best available science and technologies. The amount of climate finance flowing towards climate change mitigation and adaptation should correspond to the needs of developing and climate vulnerable countries. Said needs should reflect both the climate, the economic and non-economic losses and damages from climate change impacts, and at the same time, the needed future investments for the projected increase in climate and disaster risks, especially without climate action. The Philippines calls for directing more financing to urgent adaptation measures, enhancing local capacity and enabling climate-positive economic development benefits, such as resilient livelihoods, and accompanied by transfers of technical know-how, organizational managerial skills, access to new markets. With this climate financing complemented by viable and effective technology transfer and country-specific capacity building must be mobilized towards concrete projects, programs and initiatives in developing and climate-vulnerable countries without having to forego opportunities to meet our own development agenda. Our collective ambition of scaling up climate action should be anchored on a transparent, accessible, predictable, and efficient or TAPE mobilization of climate financing. Colleagues, on succeeding initiatives, our succeeding initiatives must be swift and effective. Failure to do so may negate the collective progress we have already achieved. Let us all work to break down the barriers to ambitious climate financing. Let us all endeavor for a climate financing that offers more sustainable results. We therefore look forward to the combined efforts of our trust building and partnership in order to achieve sustainability, inclusivity, and resiliency for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next we have Women and Gender Constituency.
Sorry. Thank you, Excellencies and distinguished representative. I speak on behalf of the Women and Gender Constituency. The story of the 100 billion goal is a political one of broken promises and broken trust. It was a politically determined goal, completely inadequate to the needs of developing countries and their communities and people impacted first and worst by climate change and not in line with the responsibility of developed countries to deliver climate finance, given their role in creating the climate emergency. And the lack of political will is at the heart of its non-delivery. Unfortunately, in contrast, there is ample political will to continue subsidizing fossil fuels and to invest in greater militarization. Moving forward, the focus must be on climate justice, solidarity, accountability and transparency to apply lessons learned until 2025 and thereafter for the NCQG. First, the goal must not only be met, but surpassed as quickly as possible. We urge the substantial increase of adaptation finance beyond doubling delivered grants, especially full-cost grants, with priority for the most vulnerable, including with focus on building the resilience of social systems. In light of the unsustainable debt burden, we need damage via loss and damage financing facility that ministers should decide to establish here. As we are acknowledging Gender Day today at COP, we must commit to center all climate finance provision in human rights and gender equality with a focus on improving meaningful participation and decision-making from women, diverse gender groups and other often marginalized people for locally led action. Very little climate finance is currently directly accessible to them. Trickle-down climate finance does not work. By some accounts, women and feminist groups can access less than 0.1% of climate finance. This has to change. There are feminist models to build from instead of creating new mechanisms from scratch, for example, such as scaling existing enhanced direct access modalities, small grants provision, or participatory grant making. Lastly, we ask to redirect the focus on mobilizing the private sector to engaging domestic, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, the business segment where women entrepreneurs are traditionally most strongly represented. They are the backbone for the economic and social transformation of societies. The transformation we need requires political will with the right technical tools. Both are at your disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies. We still have many speakers and interventions on the list, and we really want to give everybody the floor. So we will continue a bit further, 6 o'clock p.m. But now a short summary from the moderator's side, and we want to already now thank you, Your Excellencies, for the rich discussions. The many interventions we have heard today show the great interest in this crucial subject matter. Let us briefly reflect on what we have heard here today. We have heard definitely grave concerns from many of you that a gap in reaching the 100 billion goal continues to remain. There is a general sense of urgency that we need to speed up the provision of climate finance in light of the scale of needs of developing countries, and also in light of the urgency to scale up ambition, as well as address challenges developing countries are being faced with in this context, including with regard to increased debt burden due to climate action. Yet, it is encouraging to see that developed countries continue to make significant efforts to reach the goal and enhance their efforts expeditiously. We would like to thank Your Excellencies from Canada and Germany for their work and presentation of the Climate Finance Delivery Plan Progress Report today. We have heard many calls today that there is urgent need for significantly increased adaptation finance, particularly grant-based and from public sources, and a balance between mitigation and adaptation. In this context, we have heard that efforts to increase grant-based finance are ongoing, with various parties highlighting their efforts in doubling adaptation finance, yet that much more is still to be done. It has definitely been a great pleasure and honor to co-moderate the discussion this afternoon. Unfortunately, I have to leave now for another engagement, but I really look forward to discussions during this week on various topics. I leave you now on the capable hands of my colleague Shona and our finance lead Outi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And if I may continue from what has already been said, we have also heard that there is an urgent need for funding arrangements for loss and damage. Furthermore, we have heard issues around sources, and in particular calls around the importance of increasing concessional finance and the role of MDBs in this regard. We have heard that issues around access remain, including with regard to direct access, and have heard calls for harmonization and simplification of procedures. We have also heard about the important role of the private sector, particularly in the context of the transformational shift and shifting of trillions that is required in light of the current challenges. Yet, we have also heard challenges around this issue and a recognition that expectations have so far not been met with regard to the role of the private sector plays. At the same time, we have also heard definitional issues with regard to climate finance. Furthermore, we heard calls for increased efforts to ensure just transitions. We also heard that lessons learned in the context of the 100 billion goal also need to be taken into consideration when it comes to deliberations on the new collective and quantified goal. In closing, we would like to thank for the rich discussions today and very much look forward to hearing from the remaining speakers. I once again thank you for all the speakers and ministers and representatives from all countries for your contribution. If I may now request Madagascar, followed by Austria and Vanuatu. Madagascar, the floor is yours.
Madame la Présidente,
Ms. Moderator, Your Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. I am one of the SIDS countries that is subject to many climate change repercussions, and this is, if Madagascar is not known to you, Madagascar faces a lot of repercussions due to climate change. We are keen to emphasize that Madagascar has emphasized its willingness to be in line with international agreements in coping with climate change, atop of which is identifying the NDCs and setting national plans for adaptation and mitigation, as well as setting a national strategy to identify NDCs. Madagascar continues to show a willingness to reach the Paris Agreement goals and to set a long-term strategy to reduce CO2 emissions. The costs of these commitments might reach $20.8 billion for Madagascar to be able to commit to its obligations. Madagascar is going to provide $70 million by 2030. Via these contributions, Madagascar can benefit from the available funding. Madagascar continues to urge advanced countries to fulfill their commitments and promises in order to fulfill the 100 billion goal annually to be directed to developing countries. This is a main necessity for us. In Madagascar aims in the upcoming years to make best of these pledges made. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madagascar, for the intervention. If I may now request Austria to make an intervention. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Excellencies, colleagues. Austria is strongly committed to contributing its fair share to climate finance. And as many around the table, I may only echo the deep disappointment that the goal of mobilizing collectively the $100 billion in 2020 has not been met. So I'm very happy to announce that my ministry's budget for international climate finance will be increased by €40 million in 2023, bringing it to 70 million in total. And in the years 2024 to 26, the annual budget for climate finance will be €90 million. This means annually 16 million in addition to what my ministry is currently contributing. All in all, this is an additional 200 million euros new and additional money until 2026. A significant part of this budget, 50 million euro, will be dedicated to funding for averting, minimizing or addressing loss and damage and to adaptation funding. The bilateral projects that my ministry is funding have a focus on supporting vulnerable local and indigenous communities in their struggle against the effects of climate change, with a special focus on women. We will further increase the efforts in this regard. But it is very clear that public finance can only go so far. We absolutely need to increase our efforts to get the private sector on board in our collective effort to achieve the temperature and the resilience goals of the Paris Agreements. We need to work to align finance flows with these goals, and I really would urge us to have this strongly reflected in the cover decision of this year's COP meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Minister. I now have Minister from Vanuatu, followed by Bhutan and Monaco. Vanuatu Minister, your floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are out of time and we're out of money and we're out of patience, and we must establish at this COP27 a loss and damage finance facility. We wish to join and endorse Tuvalu's concrete recommendations in this regard. The establishment of a loss and damage fund will determine the success or failure of our collective leadership here. Vanuatu first raised the issue of loss and damage finance in 1981, and 40 years later, the need is now existential. We think another 2 years is untenable. More and more, my government is forced to use its own financial resources to meet the cost of climate relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction, diverting resources away from essential development priorities such as education and health. Access to the current financial mechanism is difficult, and the processes are too burdensome. Simplified and streamlined access is critical. We've done our job and quantified our needs. The cost of Vanuatu's 2002 revised and enhanced NDC is $1.2 billion by 2030, with more than $700 million needed to fund life-saving adaptation. But current flows of climate finance do not meet these needs. We are still waiting on the broken 100 billion climate promise. We urgently need a definition of climate finance as a prerequisite to develop a new goal. We know that climate finance is not repackaged ODA, but must be grant-based, and new and additional and at the scale of the need. Resources must be accessible by grassroots organizations, indigenous peoples and local communities. Climate finance must be gender responsive, with a view to building and strengthening the capacity of women. What have the women, girls and indigenous people of Vanuatu done wrong for them to have to foot the bill for the mess caused by others? Law will ensure that all states invest sufficient finance to prevent harm from fossil fuels. And that is why Vanuatu, as part of a coalition of 18 nations, will release this week the text of a UN General Assembly resolution seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, clarifying the legal obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse effects of climate change. The General Assembly vote will happen as soon as next month. I call on all countries to vote in support of this resolution at the UN General Assembly to better understand our international legal obligations and thereby motivate the mobilization of climate finance to address the impacts of this crisis. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister. If I may now request Bhutan to make an intervention, followed by Monaco and France.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bhutan would like to thank the Honorable Minister from Bangladesh for presenting the LDC position on climate change, and Bhutan supports the position. Bhutan is concerned with the slow progress on climate finance. Climate finance is crucial in supporting countries in adapting and mitigating climate impacts, particularly LDCs who are hit the hardest. Bhutan is a carbon neutral country, and Bhutan, since COP15 in Denmark in 2009, has committed to the global community to remain carbon neutral at all times. However, every year it is a challenge for Bhutan to live up to this global commitment due to increasing risk of climate change-induced vulnerabilities such as flash flood, glacial lake outburst floods, windstorm, landslides, etc., due to its fragile mountainous environment. Therefore, adaptation is a priority. Adaptation must be supported with grant financing and with the right balance between mitigation and adaptation. We would like our partners to live up to US $100 billion climate financing commitment, and adaptation must receive equal share in climate financing, and doubling of adaptation funds to US $40 billion a year by 2025 is a welcome initiative. Bhutan would also like to highlight that support in the reporting in line with transparency requirement is also critical as we prepare to deliver a biennial transparency report in 2024. In this context, we would like this fund to be mobilized through a clear roadmap and provide direct access with simplified process as a predictable, sustainable, and in a timely manner. In conclusion, we would like to propose if the process for accessing climate financing could be made simpler, faster, and predictable for countries to plan, implement climate-related activities in a timely and comprehensive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may now request Monaco to make an intervention, followed by France and Morocco.
Merci, Madame. Nous le savons, nous devons redoubler d'efforts.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We know that we need to double our efforts in order to fulfill our obligations that have been previously made. Accordingly, Monaco reaffirms its commitment to fulfilling its share in order to attain the $100 billion US dollar target. We are about to set an international plan for the year 2030, and we have ratified that plan. And in 2022, we have presented more than 100 million euros to assist countries suffering from climate change repercussions. $5 million were also directed towards projects, climate projects, and directing a bigger share of that at LDCs and the SIDS. These are all countries that face the greater repercussion of climate change. Monaco is one of the main contributors to the GCF, and if this fund is considered the main fund for many of the mega projects, accordingly, we need to facilitate access to the funds of the GCF, and we hope that this tool can play an incentivizing role in mobilizing funding needed at higher levels, especially from the private sector. We are determined to foster the GCF